The rain that night didn't fall. It wept, as if the sky itself mourned something unseen. And Emery Blake, with her tired eyes and aching feet, thought it was just another dreary shift carved into the thankless rhythm of a nurse's life. She had stayed late, selflessly, to cover for a colleague with sick kids, never imagining that this act of kindness would become the reason her life unraveled and rewrote itself in one haunting stroke. The city around her was blurred, not just by rain, but by fatigue and 1,000 unspoken thoughts. Her mother's mounting hospital bills, the loneliness clawing at her ribs, and the persistent weight of dreams she'd folded away long ago. Her umbrella trembled in her grip as the storm clawed at her coat, and as she stepped off the curb with a sigh, caught between resolve and surrender, her eyes caught someone, crumpled near a graffiti-stained brick wall like a discarded soul. His presence felt wrong for that hour, for that place, for someone wearing a coat that looked like it belonged on a runway instead of a gutter. Her instincts roared louder than her exhaustion, pulling her toward him. He was slumped, head bleeding just slightly at the temple, but it was his eyes, sharp, lost, screaming in silence, that shattered her breath. She crouched down despite the cold seeping into her bones. "Are you okay?" she asked gently, her voice more soothing than she intended, more intimate than she realized. He flinched as if her words carried ghosts, then nodded with a kind of broken dignity. It wasn't until she raised her phone's flashlight that time halted. The light illuminated a jawline the tabloids once worshipped, a mouth hardened by months of silence, and eyes the color of frost and heartbreak. Logan Pierce. She whispered his name in her head like a secret, the name that once dominated every headline. The man who vanished after tragedy stole his future. And there he was, no cameras, no bodyguards, no arrogance, just a wounded man lost in the storm of his own collapse. She didn't ask why he was there, what had happened, or why someone worth millions looked like a man who had nothing left to lose. There was something sacred about not asking, about letting someone bleed without turning it into a question. So she took him home. Her apartment was nothing glamorous, a small one-bedroom with secondhand furniture, flickering lights, and a kettle that whistled like it had lungs. But it was warm, and somehow he fit into that space like he'd always belonged to a quieter world. She cleaned his wound while he sat rigid, almost afraid to breathe, and the silence between them wasn't awkward. It was a blanket, heavy with emotion, wrapped around two people who didn't need words to understand pain. He spoke little, just his name, Logan, as if he were anyone. She offered soup, dry clothes, and quiet. He accepted only the quiet. The hours stretched like honey dripping from a jar, slow and thick with meaning. Somewhere between midnight and 3 a.m., their hands brushed as she passed him a blanket, and the electricity in that moment was more than attraction. It was recognition. She saw a man who had been burned by the world, and he saw a woman who still believed in mending what was shattered. They didn't kiss. They didn't make promises. But they sat on that worn-out couch, side by side, her shoulder brushing his as the storm outside softened into whispers. It was the kind of night that wrapped around the soul and stayed there, hidden but alive. When Emery blinked in the morning light, she reached for him instinctively. But he was gone. No note, no name, just the faintest indentation on the pillow beside her, and a silence that echoed louder than a goodbye. The door was unlocked, the air was cold, and everything looked the same. Yet everything inside her had changed. She touched the place on her arm where his hand had rested for a fleeting second. And though it had only been one night, it was a night that carved itself into her very being. She didn't know if she'd ever see him again, didn't even know the full truth of why he was there. But she knew, deep in her chest, in the hollow he left behind, that something had been awakened, something irreversible, something destined to rise again. She just didn't know when or how devastating it would be. The silence he left behind had not just echoed, it had rewritten Emery's entire existence. And 5 years later, she stood taller, walked stronger, but carried a heart stitched together by solitude and sacrifice. Gone was the naive nurse who once welcomed a stranger into her home on a stormy night. In her place stood a woman molded by fire, resilient, worn but unbroken, and forever transformed by the tiny miracle she now called her son. Liam, with his tousled chestnut hair and eyes carved from the same glacial blue that haunted her dreams, was the living echo of a single night she couldn't forget. Emery had stopped counting the hours she spent in the dead of night, scrolling through forums, tracing old articles, searching news archives, whispering his name into search engines as if they could conjure the truth. Logan Pierce. But every trail turned cold. Every link led nowhere. And eventually the world convinced her that maybe he had never existed at all. Maybe he had been a phantom conjured by loneliness and grief, a hallucination gifted to her by fate to deliver the one thing she hadn't known she needed. Liam. Her pregnancy had been a revelation, then a reckoning. Her mother, once her rock, turned brittle with judgment, her voice sharp and unforgiving. "You've ruined your life," she'd spat. Her father's silence was louder than any curse, and it hollowed her out from the inside. With no one but herself to lean on, Emery clawed her way through medical bills, childcare costs, and sleepless nights, fueled only by coffee, stubbornness, and the smile of a boy who looked up at her like she was the sun. Her dreams changed. It was no longer about becoming head nurse or traveling the world. It became about giving Liam a life that didn't taste like survival. She picked up every extra shift at the community clinic, mopped her own tears in supply closets, and learned how to smile through soul-crushing fatigue. Yet despite it all, her love for Liam made the pain worth it. He was curious, kind, always asking about the father he didn't know, and she told him, softly, that he was born from magic, from something rare and beautiful. Emery thought she had put the past behind her, tucked it away in that mental drawer where impossible things go. Until one golden afternoon, dressed in a borrowed dress and worn heels, she walked into the grand ballroom of a downtown hotel for a charity gala her clinic had begged her to attend. The chandeliers glittered like stars trying too hard, the air thick with perfume and performance. And Emery felt like a visitor in a world that never welcomed her. She didn't notice him at first, her mind busy scanning for coworkers, her hands still adjusting Liam's drawing that she'd tucked into her clutch-like armor, until the hum of conversation dropped from her ears and her breath cinched in her chest. There across the room, framed by opulence and shadows, stood Logan Pierce. Not the drenched, broken man who'd once sat bleeding on her couch, but a reborn version of him, sharper jaw, tailored suit, presence commanding enough to part crowds with glances. He stood with grace, surrounded by elites, a glass of something dark in his hand, nodding politely to people who adored his money, but knew nothing of his ghosts. Her heart cracked at the sight of him, not because he looked different, but because he looked untouched, as if the night they shared had evaporated from his memory like a bad dream. Her feet moved without permission, drawn to the collision course fate had orchestrated, and when their eyes finally met, her soul braced for recognition. But it never came. He looked at her with the polite emptiness of a man seeing a stranger, not a woman who once held his trembling hand, not the mother of his child. Emery felt the ground sway. How could he not see her? Did the past mean nothing to him? She blinked back the storm threatening her lashes, smiled with the grace she'd taught herself, and walked past him as if he hadn't once changed the rhythm of her heart. Inside, though, something shattered all over again. The man she'd mourned, the ghost she'd carried, stood in flesh and bone, and didn't even know her name. Emery stood frozen beneath the golden lights of the ballroom, her heart thudding like a war drum against her ribs. But she forced herself to breathe through the avalanche rising in her chest because she had to. Liam was at home waiting, curled up on the couch with his favorite dinosaur blanket and a babysitter who didn't know the storm Emery had just walked into. Her fingers trembled as she clasped her clutch tighter, as if gripping that soft leather would anchor her to a reality that suddenly made no sense. Logan moved through the crowd like a prince born to wear armor made of tailored suits and polished smiles, charming CEOs and exchanging firm handshakes with a posture that exuded control. But his eyes, those ice blue eyes, carried none of the weight they once held when he looked at her in the dark, raw and broken. They passed each other like two strangers caught in the same orbit, And every time he glanced in her direction, it was as if her face were blank canvas to him. No trace of the stormy night they'd shared. No echo of the warmth they'd bled into each other. Emery tried to vanish into the room's corners, clinging to hors d'oeuvres and fake smiles. But fate wasn't done with its cruel choreography. Just as she moved toward the exit, a deep voice clipped the air beside her shoulder, sharp and unmistakably his. "You're Emery Blake, right?" he said casually, as if the name had come to him from a spreadsheet, not a memory. "Dr. Russo mentioned you. Said you're one of the best nurses here." Her breath caught. Her name on his lips felt like a ghost returning to haunt her. "Yes, that's me," she whispered, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. He nodded, professional, detached. "We could use someone like you at our downtown facility. I'd like to talk more." It wasn't an invitation laced with history. It was a recruitment pitch. Cold, efficient, hollow. She nodded because her legs wouldn't let her run. Numbness slid over her like a second skin as he was pulled away by another donor, leaving her to drown in the space he vacated. She left early, the gala's music fading behind her like static in her ears, her heels echoing against marble tiles with every step that pulled her away from the man who didn't remember. The cab ride home was a blur of headlights and unshed tears, and when she slipped quietly through her apartment door, the sight of Liam's tiny hand hanging off the couch and his peaceful breathing made her fall apart all over again. She knelt beside him, her fingers brushing his soft curls, her heart twisting at the dimple he wore even in sleep, a dimple that matched Logan's perfectly. She pressed her forehead to the couch cushion beside her son and let the weight she'd carried for years finally collapse onto her back. How could he not remember? How could a night that rewrote her entire life be nothing but smoke to him? She wanted to believe he was confused, that time had distorted his memory, that maybe trauma had wiped that moment from his mind. But deep down she knew. He had looked directly at her, spoken her name, stared into her face, and still chosen to pretend. That realization was more violent than abandonment. It was erasure. Emery had survived heartbreak, judgment, loneliness, but nothing prepared her for the knife of indifference from the man who unknowingly helped create the one person she loved most. She tucked Liam into his bed, kissed his forehead gently, and whispered a lullaby with a voice that trembled. Then she sat on the edge of her bed and stared into the dark, into the silence, into the brutal truth that sometimes the people who change you forever can forget you like a fleeting breeze. But she wouldn't forget. Not his voice, not that night, not the look in his eyes that once begged her not to leave him alone in the rain. Now 5 years later, it was she who stood drenched in silence while he stood dry, guarded by wealth and shielded by selective memory. Emery realized then, if Logan Pierce had truly forgotten her, then maybe the man she clung to in her memories no longer existed. And the one standing before her now was a stranger who wore his face like a mask. Logan's nights grew restless, filled with shadows that whispered Emery's name, even when his mind fiercely resisted any acknowledgement of her existence. There was an ache, a fracture beneath his polished exterior, a crack in the glass of his carefully constructed world that he couldn't repair no matter how hard he tried. The way her eyes lingered in his thoughts was like a ghostly imprint, impossible to erase, yet maddeningly out of reach, because his memories were a fragmented jigsaw puzzle, shattered by trauma and loss, scattered across the fragile fabric of his mind where truth struggled to surface. Each visit to the clinic was a silent plea, a desperate attempt to touch something real, a glimpse of the warmth he once felt but couldn't name. He watched her from a distance, observing the quiet strength she radiated amid the chaos of her days. The way she moved with a grace born of hardship, the compassionate kindness in her smile as she comforted patients, and the fierce determination that flickered when she fought battles no one else could see. There were moments when the world seemed to pause, when time itself held its breath, and a spark ignited inside him. A sudden flash of memory, a distant echo of rain falling softly on broken streets, the faintest whisper of her voice calling out to him across the years. Those suspended seconds were cruel reminders of what was lost, teasing him with fragments of a past that felt both impossibly close and heartbreakingly distant. Emery, too, felt the tremors of his presence like tremors beneath her skin, unwelcome and yet undeniable. She fought the magnetic pull, wary of the man who had unknowingly shattered her life, determined to shield herself and her son from more pain. Yet with each encounter, Logan chipped away at the walls she had built around her heart, his silent watchfulness breaking through her defenses, unraveling the carefully woven tapestry of solitude she clung to. He reached out in the only way he knew how, offering her opportunities that shimmered like promises of hope. A better job at his downtown facility, resources that could change her life, a chance to step into a future she had never dared to dream of. The notes began as mysteries, slipped beneath her door or left on her car windshield. Small, cryptic messages that spoke of safety, trust, and a connection he couldn't fully explain. At first, she ignored them, afraid they would reopen wounds she had painstakingly sealed. But then, one note was signed, his name, Logan Pierce, transforming the anonymous kindness into a bold, unspoken confession. "I don't know what it is about you," the note read, "but I feel safe around you, and I haven't felt safe in years." Those words struck her like a lifeline cast across a stormy sea, hinting at a vulnerability she had never seen in the man who now stood so distant and inscrutable. The fragile threads between them began to weave a story neither dared to voice, a story of two broken souls inching toward healing. One cold evening, when the clinic was quiet and the city hummed with distant life, Logan found her outside beneath the flickering street lamp, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She had just lost a custody battle, a bitter fight where her ex had weaponized lies and cruelty to tear her world apart. The sight of her despair cracked open something primal in Logan, an instinct to protect, to hold, to be the anchor she so desperately needed. Without hesitation, he crossed the distance between them, his arms wrapping around her trembling frame with fierce tenderness. In that moment, the chaos of the past faded into stillness. The rain whispered softly around them, and for the first time in years, the world felt steady. Her tears soaked his coat, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he let her lean into him, let the silence speak the words they both couldn't say aloud. It was a fragile peace, a quiet truce between two hearts battered by life's merciless storms. But it was enough, a beginning carved from the shards of broken dreams, where hope flickered like a candle in the dark, promising that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild what fate had tried to steal. The night unfolded like a fragile dream, each moment weaving them closer as Logan gently led Emery through the softly lit restaurant overlooking the twinkling city skyline, where the mellow strains of a jazz band wrapped around them like a warm embrace. The flicker of candlelight cast dancing shadows on their faces, painting a scene of quiet intimacy that neither of them dared to speak aloud, but both deeply felt. An unspoken acknowledgement that this evening was something sacred, a tender thread binding two broken souls. Logan's hand found hers with hesitant certainty, and as the music swelled, he asked in a voice that trembled with vulnerability, "Can I have this dance?" Emery nodded, her heart pounding with a mix of joy and cautious hope, and as they moved together, their bodies swayed slowly, deliberately, as if rediscovering a rhythm long forgotten, but somehow innate, like a language spoken in silence. His fingers trembled slightly against her back, a subtle confession of the fear that lurked beneath his composed facade. And when Emery noticed, she gently brushed her palm against his cheek, grounding him in the present. "What's wrong?" she whispered, her voice soft yet steady, a balm to the storm raging within him. Logan's breath caught, and he confessed, "Every time I feel happy, I get scared it'll be taken away." The raw honesty in his words cracked open the walls he had built, revealing the fragile man beneath the millionaire's mask, and Emery's heart ached with empathy. "Then hold on to it," she murmured, her eyes searching his with unwavering tenderness. "Hold on to me." In that quiet exchange, a promise was sealed, unspoken but profound, a vow to cling to the flicker of light they had found amidst the darkness. Their lips met in a kiss that was anything but hurried, delicate, reverent, like a whispered prayer offered in the sacred space between two hearts yearning for healing. It was a kiss that spoke of patience and respect, of a love tempered by pain, but not defined by it. A love that dared to bloom slowly, carefully in the cracked soil of their lives. They didn't cross boundaries or rush toward anything they weren't ready for. Instead, they allowed the moment to breathe, to linger, to imprint itself on their souls. When Logan finally walked her to the door and kissed her forehead with a tenderness that sent a shiver down her spine, he whispered, "You're the first light I've seen in a very long time." Words that wrapped around Emery like a warm embrace, filling the emptiness she had carried for years. As she lay in bed that night, tears glistened on her lashes, tears not of sorrow but of something fragile and new, something that almost felt like hope, a delicate bloom pushing through the frost of past heartbreaks, promising that maybe, just maybe, the storm had passed and a gentle dawn awaited them both. Logan stood frozen in Emery's modest kitchen, the weight of the small drawing in his hands threatening to crush the breath from his lungs. A child's simple sketch, naive and heartfelt, depicting a boy with striking blue eyes, eyes that mirrored his own, accompanied by the clumsy crayon inscription, "Me and Daddy," a phrase so innocent yet so heavy with meaning that it shattered the fragile world he had built around himself. The realization crashed over him like a tidal wave, breaking down years of silence and distance, years lost in his self-imposed exile, his mind racing to piece together the fragments of a past he had tried desperately to bury. When Emery returned from the grocery store, the light in her eyes dimmed instantly, seeing him standing there, clutching that drawing like a lifeline, her heart pounding with the fear and shame of secrets kept and wounds left open, unable to meet his gaze as the blood drained from her face. The kitchen, once a place of mundane routines, now felt like a crucible where truths were laid bare and vulnerabilities exposed. Logan's voice, raw and cracked with disbelief and pain, broke the silence as he demanded, "Why didn't you tell me?" The question hung in the air, heavy and accusing, and Emery's response trembled on the edge of heartbreak and resilience. "Because you left without a word. I didn't even know your real name until months later. I searched for you, but you were gone." Her words were a mixture of bitterness and sorrow, a reflection of the years spent carrying the weight of his absence, raising their son alone against a backdrop of judgment and loneliness. Fighting battles most parents never face, her nights filled with worry and longing. Logan's face betrayed the torment within, his eyes wide with the desperate ache of a man drowning in regret, a man who had lost precious time and moments that could never be reclaimed. The silence that followed was suffocating, each second stretching endlessly as he grappled with the enormity of the revelation, the undeniable truth that the child he never knew existed was his flesh and blood. "Is he mine?" The question was a whisper, a fragile thread of hope and fear intertwined, trembling on his lips like a prayer. Emery's affirmation was steady, unwavering. "Yes, Liam is your son." The confession broke something inside him, and he sank heavily into the chair behind him, overwhelmed by a silence that screamed with all the things left unsaid: apologies, explanations, regrets, promises yet to be made. The room seemed to close in around them, filled with the echoes of past mistakes and the fragile possibility of redemption, as Logan wrestled with the realization that the life he had tried to escape had been waiting for him all along, embodied in the bright eyes of a little boy who deserved more than absence and silence. Emery's eyes glistened with tears, not only from pain, but also from a glimmer of hope that this shattered moment might mark a beginning, that the man who had left her broken might find the courage to step back into their lives, to face the consequences of the past, and perhaps one day rebuild the family that fate had almost stolen from them. Logan's heart pounded with a mixture of fear and determination, the ghosts of his past clashing with a newfound resolve to make amends, to be the father Liam needed, and to earn back the trust of the woman he never stopped thinking about, even in his darkest moments. The night stretched on, thick with emotion and unspoken promises, as two souls scarred by loss and betrayal stood on the edge of an uncertain future, the fragile threads of love and forgiveness beginning to weave a tentative bridge over the gulf that had kept them apart for so long. Logan's world had been torn apart, shattered into 1,000 pieces by years of silence and absence. Yet it was that very silence that made every word, every moment of reunion, feel like the most fragile and precious treasure. The boy who shared his icy blue eyes, Liam, was the living proof of a love that had been buried but never truly lost. And Emery, the woman who had carried that love through storms of pain and abandonment, held his heart in her hands once more. The first days were tentative, wrapped in uncertainty and cautious hope, as Logan took tentative steps into their lives. Steps filled with the quiet tenderness of a father trying to understand his son and a man seeking redemption. Picking Liam up from daycare, he nervously held the boy's small hand, the same way he had dreamed of doing years ago, but had never dared to hope for. Museums became their sanctuaries, places where the world's wonders gave way to a gentle unfolding of their own family story, with Liam's shy laughter echoing in galleries and Logan's steady presence becoming a new kind of certainty for the child. Evenings brought homework sessions where frustration met patience and laughter slowly replaced the long years of distance and doubt. Liam's walls came down one brick at a time, the boy recognizing something in Logan that transcended absence, an invisible thread woven between their souls. Emery, standing at the edges of this fragile new life, found herself torn between protecting her son's delicate heart and allowing herself to hope again. Feeling Logan's presence both as a balm and a storm that stirred old fears and new desires. But just as the fragile peace began to bloom, the past slammed back with brutal force. Emery's ex resurfaced, a man driven by jealousy and spite, his voice cold and threatening as he demanded full custody of Liam, seeking to tear apart the family that was just beginning to heal. The courtroom became a battlefield where pain, betrayal, and hope collided. Logan, once a man broken by loss and haunted by memories, transformed into a fierce protector, his resolve as unyielding as steel. He hired the best lawyers, confronted the icy disdain of Emery's family, who had once turned their backs on her, and made a public, undeniable declaration. Liam was his son, Emery his partner, and together they would fight for the family they deserved. The weight of the past hung heavy in the air, but Logan's voice cut through the silence with a raw, aching truth. "I lost one family once. I won't lose another." Those words carried the weight of years filled with regret, longing, and a promise of unrelenting dedication. In the courtroom's charged atmosphere, Logan locked eyes with Emery, his gaze filled with vulnerability and hope as he pleaded, "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a second chance to deserve it." The judge's decision came like a balm to their battered souls, awarding them joint custody and the legal affirmation of the family they had fought to reclaim. Emery's defenses crumbled in an instant as tears of relief and joy streamed down her face. She collapsed into Logan's arms, the strength of their shared pain dissolving into the warmth of forgiveness and renewed love. Liam, eyes sparkling with the pure joy of belonging, ran between them, anchoring their fragile but unbreakable bond with the innocent power of a child's love. The long years of silence, the unspoken heartaches, the lonely nights filled with unanswered questions, were shattered like glass underfoot, replaced by a love that burned brighter for every trial it had endured. They were no longer two broken souls adrift in a storm of regret. They were a family reborn from the ashes, standing strong against the world's storms. In that moment, beneath the watchful gaze of the judge and the soft murmur of the courtroom, a new chapter began. A chapter where redemption was not a distant dream, but a living, breathing reality, where past wounds no longer dictated their future, and where the fragile, painful silence gave way to a symphony of laughter, hope, and unwavering love. Logan and Emery's journey was far from over, but they faced it together, bound by a promise that no darkness could ever undo. The promise of family, forgiveness, and the fierce power of love that refuses to die.